So I'm Justine Clark, and I'm, as many of you know, the co-founder and director of Parla. This series, Light at the End of the Tunnel, is a collaboration between Parla and Monash Architecture, and normally my colleague Naomi Stead is here to welcome you all and to do the acknowledgement of country on behalf of both Monash and Parla. But Naomi's not with us today, so I will be taking that role. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of country across the many nations of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. In particular, we acknowledge the peoples of the Greater Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which Monash operates and on which our speakers are joining us from today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the Indigenous Australians who are part of the Parla community. So, welcome. This is the 14th session in the Light at the End of the Tunnel. 14 Friday lunchtimes, kind of seems like a lot. So this is our series looking into architecture as a profession, discipline and practice, and how it is and will be affected by the pandemic. I mean, we're really interested in providing a sense of a way forward, multiple ways forward, and covering a broad range of topics within that theme. So today's session is the second looking at cultural diversity. Sonia Sarangi was a speaker at the first session on this topic, which looked at individual experiences, and I'm really thrilled that she's joining me again today as a co-host in Naomi's place. So welcome, Sonia. We're joined by speakers Tiwa Gill and Sarah Buckeridge, and Sonia's going to introduce them more fully in a few moments. But some protocols, many of you will know these. As always, please keep your microphone on mute unless you're actually speaking. Obviously, when we invite you to ask a question, you'll need to unmute. If you can, please do leave your camera on. It's really great to sort of see this gallery of faces and to feel a sense of connection to a community, and makes it feel more like an event. These events are informal but informative. Sonia and I will ask questions throughout to keep things flowing. And as many of you know, we also take questions from the floor throughout the session. So if you've got a question, put it into the chat function. My colleague Susie will be in there keeping an eye on them and throwing questions to us. We will then ask you to put your question if you're able to. If you're not, put a note in the chat and we will ask it for you if you have not access to your speaker or something. Please also add in observations, comments and experiences into the chat. It's really great to see that parallel conversation going. And although of course we can't get to every question or every comment, they do really help inform topics of future events, but also the kind of broader content that Parla is producing at this time. But we do remind you that if you're going to tell us about an experience that's not such a positive one, please don't name the practice or individuals involved. That's to protect you and to protect us. So to our topic, at the beginning of the previous session on cultural diversity, I outlined the limited data that we have on the cultural backgrounds of the profession. I'm not going to go over this again in detail, but I do want to point out and remind us that the Parla census reveals a very broad cultural diversity within Australian architecture. This, of course, is not well reflected in the senior levels of the profession or in its public culture. So in this session, we're interested in how we can create and manage workplaces that are actively inclusive of cultural diversity. If we want to ensure that the more senior levels of the profession better reflect the diversity as a whole, and the communities we serve, how can we support people to rise through the practices, systems and processes that make up our profession? What does an inclusive practice look like? So we're very lucky to have Tiwa and Sarah here to help us guide that conversation, and I'm just going to ask Sonia now to introduce them a little more fully.
Thanks, Justine.
Now I can see you all.
Thank you also to Tiwa and Sarah for your time today. Tiwa is a studio manager at Grimshaw Architects. She has a role in people and culture and studio management in both small and large studios. She has worked closely with owners and leaders of practices to implement changes in employee participation in workplace culture and is a strong advocate for an inclusive and diverse workplace. Sarah has been a director of Haybold since 2007, and since that time, the practice has grown to become a national one, taking across a vast scales of project in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane, and she was named co-managing director earlier this year. She has a deep interest in creating sustainable communities, shaping planning policy around affordable housing, and integrated mixed-use precincts. Sarah is a long-term member of the AIA and the Victorian Planning and Environmental Law Association, as well as an active member of the Property Council of Australia, serving on the Planning and Info Committee as a sponsor for several Haybold Architects in the 500 Women in Property program. Thank you, both of you, for coming today.
Great. Thank you, Sonia. Okay, I thought we might start with a similar question to how we started our last session, and that session we asked our speakers how what kind of opportunities they found in having a number of cultural viewpoints to draw on. We thought we'd turn that question into the question of practice, and we're interested to have Tiwa and Sarah begin by reflecting on what the opportunities for practices are in bringing different cultural viewpoints. There's really a very clear ethical case for cultural diversity, but what's the business case? What are the benefits to practice of having an inclusive workplace which actively supports cultural diversity? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in if you like.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Justine. It's been really terrific to have to reflect on this topic. And I was thinking about it that I've spent quite a lot of my career reflecting on gender in the workplace, and perhaps less time actively thinking about this topic. And, you know, that's been a very valuable experience in itself. Obviously, for us as a business, having a diverse workplace is going to bring that breadth of view, that breadth of experience and perspective. And I was interested in your last session, you know, that avoidance of groupthink. I thought that was a really interesting point that came up. But when I think about perhaps the core of your question is a little bit what are the business drivers as well for this decision. It's been really important to our practice really in a number of areas of our work. Haybold's got strong pillars in both the sort of development world and the housing space. And then we've also been very active in the education space. And really that diversity of our employees has been very relevant to both. So when I think about more the investment that's come in from international clients, it's been hugely important to have a diverse culture within our practice, including leaders who come from diverse backgrounds. So Eugene Cheng, for example, is one of our directors. He was born in Singapore and he's been with us for a long time. He studied in Melbourne, but he's really now made that a really important part of his practice to bring his cultural understanding to bear when it comes with working with our Southeast Asian clients and now also mainland Chinese clients and so forth. And for him, it's about sharing his knowledge, but also, yeah, helping them navigate the local conditions and contexts, because I think we have preconceptions about what those cultural groups might be looking for, and equally they bring to Australia or trying to work within the Australian framework some preconceptions from working in their home country that perhaps they need assistance with and help to navigate. So that's one really been an important aspect. And just really quickly, the other very important part of our work is in education. And we've worked for such diverse clients, you know, every denomination of school, for example, Islamic colleges, Jewish schools, Catholic, you know, diverse state government schools, etc. And we've actually been able to harness some of our own staff to help us deal with some of the cultural nuances and sensitivities that might be important to those projects. So yeah, it's been really valuable to us.
I think, Sarah, if I can echo that. Oh, sorry, Justine, did you want to ask a question?
I was just going to go, Tiwa.
Oh, no, look, you know, Grimshaw is a global company. We have studios around the world, so there's sort of kind of diversity in that. But within the Australian practice here, because we work on global projects, as you said, Sarah, we have a very diverse range of resources, and we do a lot of work in the Middle East and also in Southeast Asia. So we have a lot of people who are bilingual, even trilingual, that really add to the kind of, I guess, diverse groups. But I think, you know, the point about that sort of diverse workspace is about that diverse groups, you know, engage in creative conflict. And I think that, you know, really leads to kind of better decision making and introduces new ideas and ways of thinking, and, you know, hopefully increases creativity and innovation. So just from those discussion groups, I think that's where the key points are. You know, perhaps I've had, you know, been fortunate enough to work in practices where there have been, you know, a lot of diversity, and both in terms of, you know, ethnicity and religion and race, and we tend to always focus on gender, and that's still a very key part of, you know, discussing that, you know, inequalities or underrepresentation within more kind of senior levels of the practice. So, you know, I often think too, sometimes do people ask me to speak at things or participate because I am Asian and I tick a certain box or so forth of diversity. But I think that, you know, I don't know. I think that just people from different backgrounds, they just add so much more. We're all a part of a tapestry that adds value, you know. So I think it's about harnessing just difference that will ultimately lead to better outcomes. And in terms of all our sector work, I mean, we do a lot of aviation, a lot of rail, and they are in different countries. So we do have a real repository of diverse opinions, and therefore, you know, design approaches. I've just had a conversation actually with our Chief People Officer in New York to sort of push the kind of, I guess it's not an HR agenda, but it's a leadership agenda about, you know, we do a lot of reporting on gender and race statistics, and America has a particular quota to fill in their practice. And I'm saying, well, what are we doing with these numbers? You know, the data's great, but what are we actually doing to improve difference and diversity? And I think, you know, she sort of looked at me this morning, said, we're going through a pandemic, we can't, you know, we're distracted, we need to get back on track. And I said, but this is a perfect time, you know, this is a perfect time to reimagine where we could be and reimagine the kind of ecosystem that we want for the practice. That's just a bit of a side note, but I thought that was a really interesting conversation I had this morning, because it, you know, I was sort of thinking about these questions about, you know, what makes a really kind of true culturally inclusive workplace, and, you know, how do we establish a supportive culture? You know, leaders need to be visible, you know, but most of all, we you know, they need to allow and facilitate, you know, their team to participate and engage in conversations that really ultimately influence decision making. And, you know, going to your point about delivering, you know, architecture and the best design outcomes, you know, it's all part of that sort of tapestry that I'm talking about. So I've probably spoken a lot. Sorry, Justine and Susie.
Oh, it's great. I mean, you've gone straight into the next question, which is perfect.
Right.
So the next question that I had is about what are the fundamentals of a culturally inclusive workplace? Because it's one thing to have people with diverse backgrounds. It's another thing to have a culture of trust and safety, where people feel safe and comfortable to contribute, safe and comfortable to bring their cultures with them. And that evolved, you know, yes.
And just to deepen your question, what I often find, and I've this is from personal experience and what others have shared with me, recent graduates, is that often people of cultural background, there is a lot of self-policing, and they feel hesitant to bring all of themselves to their workplaces. So there's something to be mindful there, that how do you create that comfort level so that they really can bring their true full selves, you know, whether it be attire or other things, they can bring their true full selves to their workplace, because the default is that there is a lot of self-policing so that they can blend in.
That's an interesting point, Sonia. Are you okay for me to jump in, Justine?
Yes, please do.
That idea about you're not aiming to almost mentor people to mirror the dominant cultural norms. You know, this is the issue, I think, that's sometimes tricky to navigate or even talk about, find the right language to talk about this stuff. We've had a mentoring program that is quite broad-based, but we hope that it's very targeted. And it's called the GROW mentoring program, but what we've done is we've partnered people within the office. But the idea is that before they just get thrown in a room together, it's more about people putting out almost an EOI and explaining why do they want to engage in that mentoring, and what are they hoping to get out of that. And often, more times, 9 times out of 10, it's not about knowing more about architecture or learning about construction. It's all about these interpersonal skills, negotiation skills. It might be, how do you navigate a career? And I think that sometimes might be about helping younger, culturally diverse staff who perhaps are starting out and don't have that confidence to develop their own style. It's not about everyone trying to mimic the loud, older white male developer in the room and start learning about footy. You know, it's not about that. I mean, God knows I've struggled with that over the years. But it's also about saying, well, what's your style? What's authentic to both your personality, your individual aspirations, and your cultural heritage? Because there's also a danger that things just sort of get lumped into, you could stereotype to say that some of our young Asian female staff are quite reserved or quiet, but the lived experience is not that. And we have the same range of personality types and styles and within that subgroup that you would expect. And that's really what we're trying to support, is individuals to develop their careers in a supported way, and perhaps have that space to have those more personal conversations, as well as those professional opportunities that it can be done in a safe way, which is the usual things: internal workshops, the chance for our international students to present their work, which often will come from a quite specific cultural perspective. So, that's all part of the puzzle. But I do think that sort of, particularly that one-on-one relationship building, has been invaluable to sort of try to deal with some of those issues, Sonia.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sarah. I mean, self-promotion doesn't come easily from everyone, to speak up. And I think, whether it's your personality or you might be in a less visible role, you might sort of get lost in the system. So I think that sort of advocacy, and you pointed to that mentoring, and I know most of the people on this chat are kind of aware of the mentoring programs that do exist in practices. And Chi, I know you're on this call, but, really understanding how mentoring and peer, I don't like to use the word networks all the time, but it can help improve confidence, and create that framework, for increased diversity and, also advancement. But I think you're right. You sort of got to let people sort of redefine their kind of own success in some way. And, it mightn't be through that normal kind of linear kind of career trajectory. In fact, probably that mentoring and pauses in practice and so forth, might actually lead to more of an unconventional route to the top, if that's where you want to be. But I guess it's, to empower everyone to be their authentic self, and to, as you said, to your point, Sarah, not to mimic the kind of the dominant sort of demographic. But we've got to, create a safe place for that to happen. And, through some work that Grimshaw has done, I'm sure other practices have too, and I keep nodding to Chi, but we've recently had listening and learning sessions across all levels. And they were very much an eye-opener, I think, for the managing partner to sit in them as part of the process where he needed to listen to learn because we were working through a program for the Champions of Change. But what came out of, I guess, the listening and learning sessions, apart from the themes around, I guess, flexible work and parental leave and so forth, was he actually engaged with people's stories. And I think, you know, it was a real kind of holding the mirror up to himself, because he said, I didn't believe the way I acted impacted you so much, you know, and just by, I guess, making those connections made an enormous difference. And even his, you know, even some the conversations we now engage with now, since those listening and learning sessions, his language has started to change. And I think that is extremely powerful. Because it is allowing people to be their authentic selves. They were safe sessions. They were, we said they could say anything they wanted, and people were really direct, you know, constructive, direct and respectful at the same time. But I thought that that was a way to allow themselves to be authentic. And now there's that extra connection. So when you do meet in the tea room or whatever, or you're in a design review, you know, you've got that extra, you know, extra context to somebody. And I think it really does, you know, empower people to kind of be themselves.
Great. I think that's very helpful. We're starting to get some questions, so I've always got my, you know, flood of questions here. But Macarena, would you like to turn on your camera and make your comment or...
Hi, sorry, I'm just having a little bite, so I was a bit conscious of seeing myself eating in the screen. It's just something that Sarah mentioned a couple of times already. It's the importance of speaking more than one language and the uses that that can have. And I understand that sometimes speaking other languages in an office setting or can be seen as rude. But also it could create that sense of, you know, confidence or safe space that you were also talking about. So I wonder if you would be open to consider this use of other languages, not only in regards to clients and speaking their language, but also maybe having that among your office, or if that's something that happens already. Thank you.
It's a great question, actually.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We've actually really found it valuable, particularly with our mainland Chinese clients, to have that assistance through language in those meetings, whether it's through the senior staff who speak the language themselves, and sometimes with perhaps other team members who have those language skills, and bringing them in. And we don't sort of see that as rude or difficult, that's it's going to, because you're often trying to really unpack with clients some quite complex ideas and almost co-creation of what their vision is for a design. And if language is an easier pathway into that, then, you know, I think it should be supported. In terms of people speaking other languages in the office, it's not actually something that's ever occurred to me as a problem as such. You know, like it's, funnily enough, we've got 3 French Canadians in the office at the moment, which is, you know, it's quite enjoyable to be listening to French kind of in your pod when we all had the pleasure of being in a studio together. Or we've often had, you know, recently arrived Italians, or obviously, you know, the list goes on and on. But I mean, it's not something that I think it's ever occurred to us to dissuade. And it's interesting that you have that perception that perhaps there's some barriers to that within the workplace.
I often find it's the little things that cut deepest. For example, in an office where there's a lot of different backgrounds, often what happens is one person, perhaps from the dominant group, but one person gets hold of, let's say, the team radio channel. And, you know, I mean, there's something to be said to go, well, if there are French songs or Spanish songs playing in the office, that's, you know, giving control to other people of that dial. Just, it's that little thing that makes a big difference, and that you go, right, that's fine. You know, it's the little things, letting that rotation of the playlist it really matters. Tiwa?
Oh no, I look, you know, we seem to have quite a, I guess, an international workforce in the Australian studio. And we did have a situation where one project team, the dominant language was Spanish, and they used to talk about the project in Spanish, which is fantastic. You know, I always want to improve on my languages, but the thing is that no one was understanding what they were saying about a particular concrete package they were getting out, and there were sort of some errors being made, and they sort of surface at the last moment. So it's about, again, inclusivity all around. So it's great you've got that pod of people speaking a different language, but you've also got to kind of work out how it works within the kind of broader studio. I mean, like Sarah, we're doing international projects, in particular at the moment to mainland China. We're probably going for the same ones, but it's been enormously beneficial having people to negotiate with the client and understand those cultural nuances that perhaps others don't in the group, and not, you know, not just translate documents, but actually to be real kind of, you know, actors within the project, and then, you know, so that's been hugely valuable. I mean, I think there are so many different, I think we added up the other day about 38 different languages in the practice, just in Melbourne studio, and there's some I hadn't even heard about at all. So there's such a rich, diverse well there. So I mean, I don't know anyone that would not appreciate that sort of sense of diversity. But in terms of, I guess, what it adds to the kind of project world, if you could say, or diverse, it's, you know, different names are put on projects. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to get the same kind of, can I say it, Anglo-Saxon names on there. You know, there's a, you know, you see different people, and I think that's what it's all about. You know, the diverse response to a normally kind of linear approach.
I wonder if we could just continue the language theme for just a tiny bit longer. We've got a question here from Niyati about slang and diction. Do you?
I'll just unmute. Hello, everyone. I'm Niyati. I'm a second-year Master of Architecture student from Deakin University, Geelong campus. And I've been here for almost 1.5 years now. And I experienced this not at the uni, but at the part-time job that I work at. So it's not really related to architecture or construction industry. But yeah, my job involves, you know, answering calls and speaking to customers. And there was this one incident. I was speaking in English with the person on the other end. He said, can you get someone who can speak in English? And at that time, I did feel bad. Now, when I think of it, I don't really feel bad, but it's just the difference of pronunciation or diction or, you know, the slangs. It's just that the person on the other end knows a different kind of English. I know English, but it's a different kind of English. So it's just those, you know, slangs or, you know, diction that I think sometimes they do come in the picture as well. So it's not really about a different language altogether.
Yeah.
Same language and just different, you know, slangs or dialects of it.
Yeah, that's a really good thing you've raised. Accents. Yeah.
And a lot of colloquialisms that are often used in, you know, banter across the studio as well.
Yeah. They can come across as exclusionist when you're scratching your head going, what was just agreed on?
Yeah, it is interesting. The idea of accent as well is, it is interesting because when sometimes you're in a situation where there's a team that's worked on something and then you're having to present that idea back to a client group. And then sometimes there might be a team member who's been quite active in the project and might have quite a heavy accent that is quite, for people who've been working on or with that person for some time, no issue. For someone who hasn't, it might be a bit of a barrier. And so those things are things that I think we are always every day in practice kind of negotiating. And it's sort of important to push the opportunities, as you know, not to feel that that's an insurmountable barrier, but to actually provide, whether it's through support for that person or for them to be in, you know, in a team co-presenting that work so that there's a role there, not an exclusion, without sort of pretending that it's a non-issue for the client group on the other side of the table. So I think it's not a matter of just pretending it's not an issue at all and just sort of quietly shuffling that person off to the side. It's sort of thinking about how you can properly engage that person in those different roles, and if necessarily build some skills. It might not be about accents, it might be about presentation skills more fundamentally, and that crosses you know, all cultural boundaries, but it is about that. It might be targeted support, but I do sometimes, I'm quite conscious that some quite senior staff members are perhaps feeling a bit held back or restricted from some opportunities because of accent, perhaps more than language skills themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue. You know, probably those stereotypes are thrown out anyway, but it's certainly been raised, Nike, you know, in terms of people's accents and how there are perceived kind of ideas, you know, when someone speaks, and, you know, it's terrible. You know, I can only apologize because it just seems so, you know, unnecessary. Yeah, so yeah, it does, and hopefully, you know, I guess when, you know, in a workplace context, you know, as Sarah said, we can scaffold that sort of support and, you know, encourage you to keep being yourself, and, you know, promote you in these sort of, you know, in spaces in which, you know, you were key and add value. And that's the way, you know, as Sarah said, those skills cross, you know, transcend through kind of cultural barriers. So yeah, my deepest apologies, that's all I can say.
I don't think this is the space where anyone needs to apologize for someone else's behavior. Justine, do you want to jump on to leadership?
I actually thought I might just first go to Fong Li has got some very good comments about the small things that help increase inclusion, because I'm really interested both in the big aspects that you need to get right and the small things. Like, so Sonia, you were talking about you know, the radios, and Fong had some other good examples. And
yeah. So in terms of the discussions, I think it was something that I never really thought about, but in the context of today's discussions, I realised that, you know, at the end of our CBRE project management team meetings, there's often this slide that the teams or the speaker shares just to conclude the talk, which, you know, thanks everyone for coming, and rather than just saying thank you and, you know, if you have any questions, the teams actually made an active effort to find out what sort of cultural backgrounds people come from, and then on that slide they've just shown, you know, in people's different ethnic languages, you know, just the translation to their language. And I never really thought anything about it until I sort of thought about this particular talk and kind of went, oh, actually, yeah, that does make me feel included, without actually realising that, you know, it might mean a lot more to other people. And then I think the other example I had sort of placed up earlier was one of my clients, AMP Capital. They have, like, I think it was like a monthly sort of cultural food sharing session. And I think that's just about getting people together and just building rapport with each other. And, you know, we can all connect over, you know, amazing, delicious food. And I guess that's a way to break down some of the barriers between different cultures and get people to understand each other. And I think once you're able to build that connection with your peers, you're then more likely to, you know, assist them or help promote them or, you know, include them in other areas. So yeah, that's just interesting, other sort of slightly non-work related ways to support each other.
Well, actually, to me, that feels very work-related, because I feel like, isn't that a brilliant example where the organization did the legwork and found that out? And isn't that awesome that the organization did that and not the groups themselves?
Yeah.
I think that was fantastic.
That comment about food, I mean, it tends to be something that, you know, it seems easy, but it's something we've sort of found really useful to just acknowledge two important days of cultural and religious significance, and perhaps make that a bit more broad-based than just saying we're going to do Chinese New Year, which we do, but we talk about it being Lunar New Year, and we, you know, because we've got Vietnamese staff, we've got South Korean staff, we also invite staff members to explain, like just do a little intro about, you know, why that's significant, and sort of to bring a bit of meaning to the fact that we're eating dumplings, or, you know, sort of to enrich that conversation a little more. And we've done a series of those around different cultural reference points, you know, Greek Easter, etc. And, you know, we're really excited to do more of that. We unfortunately had moved into our beautiful new Melbourne studio with a wonderful kitchen area to share, and now we're all back in our, you know, in our homes. But when we do get back together, we think those things are important, because it is that point, as you say, those little moments through the year where you've then got a different point of reference to go back and to reconnect with your co-workers on a slightly different way. And I mean, one of the other things that we've also thought about is how do you build in some flexibility around different religious observances. And, you know, we've got staff who've observed Ramadan, for example, and, you know, making some affordance around fasting periods and perhaps flexible work hours, you know, having a prayer space, you know, private, discreet prayer space, etc. So there's a whole range of issues that I think at an organisational level, we just really need to be aware of, and be, as you say, be proactive about. Don't just let the person have to ask every time.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah. I think that, you know, going deeper than food, you know, I think someone presented something about putting a cookbook together of, you know, different types of food, and tick, there's your diversity kind of, you know, exercise. And for me, it's sort of beyond kind of the food court to some extent, because you do have to put meaning and context around cultural traditions and why, you know, we have them and why they exist, and, you know, like celebrating Greek Easter, why they do it that way. Rather, yeah, I think for me, to go a little bit deeper into understanding diversity around traditions and how that, you know, influences the way we work or the way we approach things. And I think you mentioned, Sarah, around about that sort of flexibility and, you know, understanding that people, you know, yeah, their traditions, we've got to honour those and respect those and how we do those. So yeah, I think to really put meaning around those occasions is really the step change that needs to happen.
One thing I have to emphasize is, you know, even when those events are done, if they're done, it's the way they're organized that often makes so much of the difference. So for example, something that is literally relying on somebody to bring in food and do the talking is different from when actually the whole team is notified a couple of days in advance. So I remember, okay, this is not an architecture company, it's an energy retailing company. And they actually sent an email out on Monday to pretty much the whole office that there was going to be this celebration on Friday, and encouraged people to actually join in, even if they weren't from that background, because a lot of people actually love perhaps engaging with that culture or the food of that culture. And so when the people who were celebrating the festival turned up on the day, they had so many co-celebrants that was not just these 3 people in a huge organization. They had 25 very enthusiastic participants. So kind of even the timing of that announcement, it's the little things again that I think signal that.
Okay, I think we should move on to leadership in just a second, but I've also just noticed this. There's a very cute comment from Badru Ahmed about Arvo. I have to say I had to learn what Arvo meant as well, Badru. But she also has a question about being concerned about being the token hire, which again, many of us have probably experienced that anxiety. Badru, do you want to put your question?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think I pretty much explained it, that I never want to become the token hire or the token international student in a studio, because if that means I have disadvantaged someone else, and then someone's lost a fair opportunity because of me. So I have defeated the very purpose I was chasing in the beginning, which is equality. I also want my employees and my tutors to tell me the truth of what I'm doing, and if that's right. It shouldn't ever be about where I'm from. Like, sometimes I feel like maybe people are afraid to tell me the truth because they're afraid of offending. So how can I be aware, like, where that's genuine, and how can I be aware so that my local friends are not, you know, I'm basically not creating the same situation I'm fighting against.
Actually, that brings me to my question about hiring.
Go.
Look, thank you for raising that. I think, and I think the word token and token sort of ship is probably often used sometimes in a blind manner to kind of put down a genuine attempt to bring diversity into an organisation. I think that, I think the majority of us, we want to appoint the best person for the job, the merit on that sort of merit basis. But, whose criteria is that, is that merit? Whose criteria is the, best person? Those ideas are just a bit more blurred. So I think, I try to say that stay away from the word token, but I understand that it does impact us. And I've just sort of tried to untangle that kind of, word in some way, because I think it's used without, without sort of, we need to sort of investigate what it means a bit more, because I think it's just pushing something aside. It's a lot more complex.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, I just want to be aware of, to know the difference between I use the word token because I couldn't think of a more appropriate word in such short time. So that's not meant to offend or you take it in a different way, but maybe there's a better word for it. But so it's just a question, just for me to be aware, to know that, in the end, I'm not creating what I'm fighting against.
Can I say, I think, the architecture profession is not really at that point where I think you'd be in any danger of feeling like you were supplanting, other candidates. I think that's probably, important not to feel that sort of onus or obligation on yourself in that situation. I mean, the whole issue, I knew we were going to be talking a little about recruitment, and it's an interesting one because, we don't have a written down policy about a quota. I mean, we've got some structured thinking about it, but it's been more of direct action, more organic action within the organisation. And really when we're looking at recruitment, we're looking at the whole person. We're looking at the folios, we're looking at the personal attributes, the experience, wherever that might be. And often, unfortunately, there's a lot of focus on software skills. It's more likely that you're going to be focusing on the level of Revit than where the person studied. I mean, that can be the reality if you're working through a particular role, for example. And I think that really then it's about just being able to be very respectful through that interview process and be prepared to have open conversations. We've got a wonderful HR manager, and she will be quite open and personal with people, even at a relatively early stage of that engagement, about their background and their interests. And we talk a lot about our own internal culture, even at that very first meeting, because it's important to us, and it's important that we get a sense of the person, not just the software.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you. That does make sense. Yes, thank you.
I mean, I think, sorry, Justine.
Yeah.
No, I think, going back to the recruitment process, and, I think globally as a company, part of the conversations are how do we make it consistent in the way we interview and understand the kind of the bias that might come into those conversations. And I notice Andy's on this call here, but I think, when we receive a lot of CVs and folios, what we're doing now is removing names and sending them just completely blind. And, it's, I think folios will speak for themselves, the presentation, that kind of, all of that makes a huge difference. But, I think, because we discussed that amongst the leadership team in the Melbourne studio, and we get an enormous volume of things. So we're trying to streamline, the process more in a way, but also we've got a kind of pro forma, template the questions, so they're consistent questions. And of course, your relationship building within these interview process, so you can make those connections. But we just, we're very mindful of building on what we had and, making the process better in some way. And we do have a diverse workforce in Melbourne. I'd have to say, I don't know Maybe it's because it's a global company, but I think that, yeah, that's what we've been doing lately, is just taking names off CVs and telephone numbers because they have a country code or things like that. And so that's been an interesting, so far it's been well received. I mean, I think people are so busy, they just look at the folios anyway, but we're trying to remove all names from every bit of correspondence just to try it. And we'll keep that going as we go forward. And I spoke to the CPO this morning, and I think London studio are doing the same as well. So we're trying to make a really genuine effort, a genuine attempt to improve our recruitment processes and have diverse, selection panel. So that's really important. And try to, I think it's, try to make that much more inclusive and, for, respect to the person being interviewed, so they get to meet people and they get to make the connections. And I know when I went for the job at Grimshaw, I said to the managing partner, I just don't want to meet the two managing partners. I actually want to meet some of your leadership team. I want to meet some females and males, and I want to meet someone from design, someone from, more of the kind of technical stream. I want to understand, I guess, the oversight of the practice or the connections that people are making with the practice, because I think when you start to talk to more people, you understand those sort of conversations that happen, and the more kind of conversations that happen, probably the more inclusive a workplace is. And that was, I think the managing partner looked at me and said, "Oh, that's a third interview." I said, "That's what I want, because I've got to feel like that everyone wants this position, not just you. Because if there's opposition to it, then I'm not set up for being the best person I can be." Sorry, I've just made that all about me, but it's I think to go to Badru's point is that, how do we make this a better process so we don't feel like we're the token, hire.
I'm just so thrilled to hear about blind applications. It is something I'm obviously crazy about. But one thing, I will just borrow Justine's question here to then address that level. That's the first barrier, and that is often the biggest barrier, that just getting hired into the firm is often a diversity barrier, and it's the same for graduates. That first hire is the hardest. And then the second one becomes leadership, because as just one of Justine's questions very correctly put, you can't be what you can't see. And, when you look further up in the profession, really beyond that sort of graduate level, there's a lot less diversity. And so what do we do to kind of build toward that more, diverse cohort of leaders? And what can practices do to support those who maybe don't see themselves as leaders?
That's, probably when I was having a bit of a look at the stats for our organisation, we sort of intuitively felt, yes, we're really diverse as well, and felt that was a good positive thing. But I was probably most pleased that our leadership group is, it's roughly a third of non-Anglo-Celtic background, and we've got two directors of Asian heritage, we've got two principals of Asian heritage, etc. That's something that, again, hasn't been done through necessarily a written policy, but it's something that I think reflects that we have invested in people, and really across the board, but really worked with people to give them opportunities. And I concur with what Tiwa was saying about Male Champions of Change process, because we're also part of that program. That's been really quite valuable, because it gives you the framework to provide opportunities for people. It gives a framework for more of these conversations to happen, and perhaps starting to see that there is some value in actively promoting and formalising some of the things that in our case, we might have just been sort of doing more intuitively for a number of years. So I think there's definitely a role to start to try to quantify and talk about these things and be more overt with staff that those opportunities are there. In terms of what we actually do to promote people, it's not just about, it's that idea of sponsorship. So that's a term, it's a bit of a management speak term, but it's something that came from the Male Champions of Change, in that it's not just about always mentoring people. It's actually taking people with you to meetings, you know, making sure that they get to be part of the networking opportunity. In the case of the Property Council, the 500 Women in Property program, you know, we've supported people, and it so happens that a number of the young women that we've put through that program in recent years have been of Asian heritage. That's not that we selected them because they were Asian, but because it was the right time of their career. And we felt they would gain the most benefit at that point. But it's sort of, it's being really proactive about providing those opportunities for people, perhaps, yeah, not just giving advice, but putting them into those positions where they can succeed and grow themselves.
Absolutely. Sorry.
No,
I was just saying to say, Justine, I mean, absolutely. I think that, you know, the sponsorship is hugely important and powerful, and that everyone has that access and opportunity to do so. And you do need people to be able to champion you and be advocates for you. And I think those conversations of, you know, exist, you know, Parla's got some wonderful guides on sponsorship and equity and so forth. And, you know, the Champions of Change provide another kind of vehicle to have those conversations. They certainly complement each other. But I think sponsorship is what we probably need to improve on in the practice I'm currently with. And we're certainly looking at ways of doing that. But it is about, as is to your point, Sarah, it's about, you know, broadening your kind of, your network. And there's another kind of, you know, term we always tend to kind of, you know, play around with, but I think it's what do you want to be as a leader? Why do you want people to follow you? So, you know, how are you going to model yourself on others or be your authentic self? So absolutely we need to do better with sponsorship.
the good news is we've got one of these sessions on sponsorship in 2 weeks' time with Nat Galia, who's very knowledgeable and experienced about that. So, you know, excellent. We've got I just wonder if I might throw to Fiona Young, who is the person who's made me think most about leadership and cultural diversity. and she might have something to say about the importance of seeing people who that might help you see yourself as a leader.
Thanks, Justine. Hi, I actually work with Sarah, and hi. I guess what I wanted to say was really reinforcing some of the conversations that have been coming through today. But actually, when I first met Sarah, it was incredible. You may not remember this, Sarah, but one of the things you said to me was, don't underestimate your ability to be a leader. And for me, that was a huge thing for somebody that I did not know to say, because it really opens your consciousness about the potential that you do have. And so it was fantastic when I joined Hable, because that was when I also recognized, as Sarah said, that there's other leaders of non-Anglo-Saxon heritage. There's Anne, I can see here, she's on the call, Anne Lau, and Eugene, and also Bianca, who are directors. And again, for me, that was this sounds crazy, but like that was a really strong recognition for me. It was like, wow, I was shocked. But also it was kind of exciting to see that and to recognize that I don't think, to recognize that there's not a bamboo ceiling here. Recognizing that these guys are there as directors and that there is a path for you, and that there's a great opportunity to also be a leader to others by showing that you can take that path too.
Excellent. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you very much. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I knew you would have something very good to say. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, and there's lots of stuff happening in the chat, which I think is important. particularly going back to that idea of token, and it reiterates something I'd like to say too, is people get chosen for lots and lots and lots and lots of different reasons. And I certainly, you know, someone who organises lots of events, and people say, well, I don't want to be the token. It's like, I'm organising an event. I'm not going to have someone who I don't think will do a really good job. So no one's going to hire you. No one's going to give you an opportunity if they don't think you're going to do a good job. But the other, I'm sure when I was younger, and people are saying this in the chat too, I'm sure I used to get opportunities because they wanted, you know, in my case, a young woman. So you're only a token if you then turn up and don't do anything. So if, I mean, people are saying this in the chat too, you know, you kind of, if you turn up and make a useful contribution, you're not a token anymore, no matter the reason for being asked. But I would also say no one's going to hire you or give or ask you to speak or do anything if they don't think you can do it. So I think just, you know, let's put that aside. So much going on here. Fiona, Sonia, have you got anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I'm of course very mindful that, you know, both Tiwa and Sarah are coming from larger organizations that I feel have so much, you know, people doing, and they've got so much embodied knowledge and people doing the legwork on these thinking. And of course, the majority, I mean, not majority, but a large number of graduates are hired by practices that are small and medium. And so I suppose my question to you is, what advice would you give to a small or medium practice that you think would they could implement easily? Because I feel that it's something that the whole industry needs to shift, not just the larger practices taking on this mantle alone. It really needs to filter down because there are so many opportunities in the small and middle firms that feel very closed. So A, what would you advise them? And B, on the flip side, to borrow Justine's questions, is how do you think someone interviewing with an organization or interested in working for an organization, how can they tell that an organization is inclusive? What are the signs?
Probably that it's an interesting question. I haven't been in small practice for a while, but I think what's changed probably is that there's so many great resources now for smaller practice as well.
Houston, we may have a problem. Do you want to jump in?
I wasn't sure if it was me who'd frozen or Sarah.
Yeah, I've frozen, haven't I? Yeah. Yeah, we were doing well there. We've almost made it to the end of the hour. Just to reiterate, sorry, because you probably missed half of that. I think the tools that are out there with organisations like Parla and, you know, the Institute of Architects, etc., small practice forums and things like that are really great, and perhaps weren't there sort of 10, 15 years ago. So certainly accessing those tools would be a starting point, I would have thought. And then I think it's just, again, asking your staff, like, as you say, like, just start to have the conversations because, you know, you don't know what you don't know. You know, it's just really being a bit more adept at having these conversations. And I understand it can be a bit uncomfortable for people if they haven't gone there before. So yeah, that's probably my 2 cents, but Tiwa.
Oh, look, you know, I agree. It's about, you know, reaching out and using, you know, these repositories such as these discussion groups that people can join. It's, you know, looking at the Parla, getting the small, mediums, I mean, small practices. I used to work for a practice of about 13. That's probably quite small, what I'm used to. And it was interesting. It was diverse in terms of gender, but I was the only non-Anglo-Saxon person. And I thought, what are they doing to also reach out to, I guess, reflect the community they work for? And they're both very much involved in giving presentations and community work. So that's how they, I guess, supported diversity or try to bring diversity back into their practice. I think that, you know, the small things like Architeam, SONA, all those sort of smaller kind of social or professional bodies are really also important for practices to reach out to and acknowledge and invite speakers from those forums as well. Sorry, I think my sound's going out, so we have almost made it to the end. So I don't know if I'd answer your question, Sonia.
No,
But it's, yeah, most of my experience has been in large practices. So we have had, I guess you said, a lot of people doing a lot of thinking around these topics and around, you know, the real kind of genuine conversations that we want to hold and to, you know, continue that sort of that culturally inclusive workplace. And I think for smaller practice, they've kind of got flexibility worked out, or, you know, they've done that. The practice I worked with, everyone worked flexible, and that was great. It worked really well, but that was one thing they had in their practice. And I wanted to know how they could reach out to the community to reflect that sort of diverse clients I guess they had. So I know that Rachel and Patrick were both very, very engaged in sort of community projects, but that's how they, I guess, and they actually sponsored people to come and work in the practice as well. I think they gave a scholarship to I think an Indigenous person at the time I was there. So that, you know, there's little, I should say, very significant things you can do to help change, to bring on meaningful change and to have representation.
Fantastic, thank you.
Excellent. Well, look, we're out of time, but there's a really good question. Does anyone mind if we go and have one more question? You know, Naomi's not here to keep me to time this week, so I'm just going to ask David to pose his question. David Castro. A question about clients. Are you there, David?
Yes.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, I've had the... Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
Is everyone here from Hayball?
I used to work at Hayball. The question about clients, you know, the experience that I had at Hayball was a very good one in terms of diversity. Most of the work that I've done has been in very diverse workplaces. I have experienced in other workplaces where the clients have come in with quite different views and different values, but they may be, you know, the whale. They may have the money, they may have. So I've in my work, in my practice, I've actually rejected work from certain clients who haven't held the same values that I've held. But it is a difficult thing if they've got the money, and, you know, what is it that how would you approach that? It's a hard question.
Okay.
Did you want me to go first?
Yes, whoever would like, but what do you do if you suspect your client is not going to model the values that you would want modeled? Or as David says, what do you do about, would you be happy to be engaged by a racist client?
Oh, God.
Put into chat. He was more polite in his...
Problem is, I don't think you may know that up front.
Look, obviously, you know, we all start from a position of values and defining our values organisationally. And I think you raise a really good point. I mean, sometimes you're not even aware of these issues going in, and it's something that's sort of a dawning realisation as you might be working with a group. It was actually one example I was reflecting on with one of my other directors about this was actually not necessarily about perhaps a profit-driven ideology that was a values mismatch, but it was a religious group that we kind of had got involved with, and then found that they actually they were a Christian group, as it happens, but perhaps had unsupportable values around women. And, you know, that's a really difficult thing to navigate when you might be already starting, or you already might be part of that process. And I think all you can try to do is be as genuine as you can and hold to your own values, and perhaps say that you wouldn't go there again, and you would be a bit more careful. It doesn't happen all that often, thank goodness. But I think, perhaps sometimes we don't do enough due diligence before we start that journey, because, you know, architects get very excited about opportunities, and, you know, they're thinking about it from a design perspective, perhaps without that sort of deep understanding perhaps of where the values are coming from. So I'm not going to say it's not an issue across the profession. I think it's a real issue, and all you can try and do, I think, is be a bit more careful about those kind of relationships that you enter into, because it can be quite difficult once you're in them to step back.
Okay. Tiwa, do you have a quick response?
Oh, look, obviously it's complex, and, you know, you enter a relationship, so to speak, and there are things you're not aware of, and then you might become aware of. And of course, when you're doing work in other countries in particular, there can be sometimes a certain values is the wrong thing, but maybe laws or things that may prevent some people being able to go and present it to the client. But it's not always, as an example is, we were doing a project somewhere that they wanted to see the male present. They said they made it very clear, and you know, at what point do you evaluate that? How do you evaluate that? Because it was for a school, so you're building a school for education. It's meant to be educational, so it's complex, and I don't think there's an easy answer, but be aware of it. Just be aware of it, and understand the impact or the implications. Some people might want to work on those projects if that's the case. I worked with the practice, they were building a casino, and people did not want to work on that project because it was to do with gambling. So it's complex.
Okay, Sonia, do you want to do you have anything to say to wrap up?
No, actually, I think I've already spoken too much in the field of this thing, so I shall be silent.
All right, well, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and sorry I've let it run over without, you know, my colleague here to keep me on time. Thank you very much, Tiwa and Sarah. That was a very enlightening conversation. I have to say, quite often these Friday lunchtime sessions give me a lot of hope for the profession. Always they do. So thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. Thank you to our fabulous audience. There's so much good conversation in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get through it all. I think this is a topic we will continue talking about, obviously. So thank you very much. We have got our next Midday Monday student and young grad session on this coming Monday. So if you fall into that demographic, please do go along. They're really great. And if you don't fall into that demographic, encourage your colleagues, your junior colleagues, to come along. It's a really nice way for the younger members of the profession to start to build their own networks across the country, and where it's really very enjoyable. We are also plotting with Macarena and others to set up a new, because we don't have enough events, a new series looking at various research projects that are going on in academia, and trying to build stronger bridges between researchers and the profession. So look out for the announcement about that. I think that might be everything for now. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry I've kept you, and hopefully we'll see you all next Friday.